to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and as unusually, I'm joined only by one of my co-hosts today, Devonya Havis. But never fear, we have a special guest who we'll hear about later, and today we're talking about unruly identity. Before we do that, let's first identify what people are drinking and whether they're ranting or raving. So, Devonya, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Well, today I am going to have an amber haze mocktail. It's composed of apple chamomile syrup, lemon, and ginger beer.
Wow, sounds yummy.
And today I'm ranting. I'm ranting in particular about shock and awe tactics and the dismantling of government programs, because I'm really concerned about people who look to the government for assistance, not because they're lazy or undeserving. If we are concerned about a common good, we also need to be concerned about the least among us and the most vulnerable, and dismantling safety nets doesn't do that. It works against the fundamental ideals that are part of democracy. So that is my rant today, hearing the pain and the anguish that people are experiencing in this moment.
Yeah, for sure. So who's that sitting next to you?
Sitting next to me is Dr. Falguni Sheth. She is our special guest today. Falguni is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Emory. She holds a PhD in philosophy and has published numerous articles and books. Her most recent groundbreaking book, Unruly Women, Race, Neoliberalism, and the Hijab, explores the racial dynamics of juridical discourses that discipline Muslim women of color and Black Muslim women in the United States. Focusing on the discrimination claims of Muslim women, the book analyzes juridical and political approaches that dismiss Muslim women and other populations of color as culturally backward, misguided in their thinking, and gratuitously nonconformist. By uncovering the dynamics of social and racial division that have inhabited and inhibit liberal legal neutrality, Falguni's book offers a template for understanding how exclusion is juridically implemented for other racialized and marginalized populations. Falguni's research explores the intersections of violence, security, and political ontology as these lead to technologies of race and racialization as a strategy of political and social management of various populations. She has also served as a member of the Immigrant Rights Commission of San Francisco and is a regular organizer of the California Roundtable on Philosophy and Race. So, Falguni, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving today?
Well, I think this week it might have to be straight bourbon. Yeah, we're going to just do straight bourbon tonight. And what am I ranting or raving about? Well, actually, my rant was going to be similar to yours, Devonya, in particular about the complete ignorance of what DEI is. It actually benefits everyone before it benefits African Americans, right?
Yeah.
And so white men, white women, Latinas, Asian Americans, my people, veterans, all before it benefits Black women or other women of color, etc. So that's my rant, that the ignorance is remarkable.
And perhaps epistemic.
Yeah.
And for Dave, the epistemology of ignorance is a term popularized by philosopher Charles Mills in his groundbreaking work, The Racial Contract. An ignorance that is not merely a lack of knowing, but an ignorance that is a willful desire not to know.
Exactly. And that was published 27 years ago. And still quite relevant, unfortunately.
A history of the present. So, Rick, what are you drinking?
I'm just going to have whatever lager you have on tap, local if you have something. And unfortunately, I'm going to join the rant bandwagon. And today I'm ranting about Dr. Phil. As you all know, I live in Chicago, and Chicago has been in the news since Trump was elected because we were supposed to be ground zero for the rounding up of immigrants, and it was going to be the first large action. there was a very small action. And not only was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security here overseeing the whole thing, but of course, Dr. Phil was as well. Because of his vast expertise in Homeland Security. No, the man is a putz, and he came here just because it was a moment where he could show his face, jump on the bandwagon, and get on top of mucking up everyone's shit for no reason other than that the man is a putz. So, Devonya, having gotten that out of my system, I know we're talking about unruly identities, but how did you want to approach this?
In recent years, challenges to the status quo, including calls to defund the police, recognize the existence of non-binary people, certain focuses on reproductive justice, among other vexed issues, have been decried as identity politics. But can we so easily separate our locations within the political landscape from our identities? Invoking the notion of identity says something about who I am, my social and political group memberships and affinities. And yet, notions of identity are fraught. On one hand, it is assumed that we have the freedom to craft and construct identities of our own choosing. And yet, the way one speaks, the clothes one wears, presumptions about one's race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation, our lineages, ancestries, and histories are deeply implicated in our identities, be it by choice or imposition. For example, I choose and am also implicated as a Black woman philosopher. Some of it is imposed, some of it is by choice, some of it is a historical relationship to a particular lineage in history. Are the dismissals of certain perspectives simply a means of marking unruly identities? Usual philosophical accounts of identity frame it in the following terms. I am A, not B. A rather stiff account of identity. Another prevalent account of identity notes that identity is very unstable, that self-same identity, consistent and non-conflictual throughout time, is a fiction. And under the umbrella of identity as an unstable and sometimes contradictory category, we have thinkers like Michel Foucault who posit that identity is really an effect or product of power. We do not so much choose our identities, but we are in fact seduced into defining ourselves in ways that conform with the demands of institutions that seek to make us docile.
You know, Devonya, you raised the cockles of my metaphysician heart by starting with a basic question of what is identity and the metaphysics of identity. I love that. Thank you.
Says the postmodern philosopher.
Right.
Some of what I want to get into is that we think of identity as a way of designating something, but more colloquially, we think of identity as saying something about who we are. And in many respects, we are told or taught that we can choose it. I am struck by what happens in philosophy classrooms, especially when I'm talking about philosophy of race, feminist theory. There are these tricky ways in which we really can't fully choose our identity. So that raises questions not only about identity as a general category, it also raises questions about the relationship of identity to notions of self, personhood, subjectivity, and just to create a hornet's nest, I'll throw in citizenship. Now, before we kind of open it up, I want to offer yet another way to think of identity that is not so much philosophical as musical. And it thinks about identity as relational. So music scholars and philosophers of music, I am shorthanding this, so do not come for me. My understanding is that musical notes derive their identity based upon their relationship to other notes. In this case, one cannot make sense of musical notes outside of their relationship to other notes. And I wonder what this might suggest about the complexities of how we live and experience identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great metaphor. And I think it really helps us to understand identity from certain kinds of feminist, philosophical, and political theory of race perspectives. In fact, before we all got together at the bar, I was teaching a class on Lugones, kind of thinking about curdling and impurity and separation and asking why this was at all salient. And I think part of this is a prelude to thinking about how identity is produced. Just on a biographical note, as an immigrant, I think I've always been keenly aware that for me, identity is about legal, political, social production and interpolation. And so this is kind of what I've been fascinated by, because I think that, as you point out, Devonya, we don't always have choices about how we are produced, how we are named. And in fact, I would argue very rarely do we have a lot of choices about this, that part of this also includes history.
Right.
Historical narratives. What are the narratives that we understand as helping to produce who we are historically, politically, socially? That's also where my work on race emerges from. To think about race as part of a set of narratives. And, Rick and I went to graduate school around the same time. And one of our professors, Agnes Heller, actually spent a lot of time talking about narrative, stories and storytelling.
It makes me think of Ricoeur and this notion of narrative identity, that we weave together an identity as a story, and that story of who we are shifts depending on the audience. And there are elements of the story that remain constant, but there are also tweaks in the story that some audiences may not be able to pick up on and others may. Almost like a subterranean text in the narrative of identity.
So for Dave, we dropped a couple of names, and I'd just like to circle back and pick them up. First of all, can one of you tell me who Maria Lugones is and what she's mostly known for?
Sure. She is a feminist philosopher. I believe she's Argentine. She is one of the foremost figures in both Latina feminist philosophy and decolonial feminist thinking. One of her more popular texts, or at least one that lends itself to teaching, is called Pilgrimages Peregrinajes, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. And then she also has written some work on Quijano and the decoloniality of gender. One of the things that I find both my grad students and also undergrads really like is to try to think through these really interesting but robust categories of things like purity. How do we think about pure identity? What is the impulse for purity? What happens if we split, if we separate? How does curdling work? Her other idea is about world traveling, but in a way she's always talking about straddling different spaces multiplicitously, those tensions and relationships in between.
To pick up then back on the narrative thing, first, Devonya mentioned the 20th century French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who comes from a school of philosophy known as hermeneutics, which basically means, we could say for all intents and purposes, interpretation. And it's a school of philosophy that has to do with understanding and meaning. He was really interested in this notion of narrative, particularly in relation to this question of personal identity. And what I like about narrative, as you were raising it, Devonya, and I think this is what you were pointing to in Ricoeur's relevance here, it's not unlike your musical notes, that what counts for a narrative is not me, the narrator, but rather the story that I'm telling. What counts for the story is the ways in which the pieces hang together.
Right.
The plot moves along and the characters are connected. And so there too, when we look at identity as a narrative, then it's more about relationship. My worry about emphasizing narrative too much is it seems like we're now back on the idea of identity as something I make for myself.
Well, I also want to kind of put in a plug for narrative identity because of Ricoeur's invoking it to solve a particular problem. And that is the problem of the permanence of identity, but our awareness that identity shifts over time and that maybe we assume different identities if we're located differently. And I think that brings us back to a thinker like Lugones and the importance of understanding what it means to travel through various worlds. I am not wholly in charge of crafting my narratives. Some narratives I am in the midst of and I have to negotiate through. And this makes me think of Juanima Lubiano, who has this phrase that a number of people may have heard me quote. warfare by narrative means.
Oh.
I think on the one hand, we see narrative as something that I am wholly in charge of crafting, but also narrative can be a story that I become embedded in, that I have to navigate. And in that respect, the meaning making of the story can construct an identity that is thrust upon me, not necessarily one that I am crafting of my own choosing or one that I have power over limiting or altering.
Yeah, I think that's right. And when we think also about Ricoeur, we're thinking about memory and forgetting and the crafting of collective stories, but also how they are shaped in terms of legal theory by legal institutions, by different kinds of laws, by different events, so that it's not a purely individual or solipsistic endeavor, and that it's often in relation to different kinds of discourses.
Right. And can you say a little bit more, Falguni, about how you're thinking through discourses so that we can understand the multi-layered way in which we're engaging in these conversations, that narrative is larger than simply the story we tell. It's also what stories can be heard and in what context.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the Foucauldian discourse of numerous different kinds of sources that end up weaving a particular tale, whether it's of being an immigrant or an undocumented worker. I'm always having to go to the concrete. But also a certain political social feminist notion of discourse. I'm thinking of Iris Young, thinking about how law and the economy help to produce certain kinds of discrimination against different groups and how one responds. But then I'm also thinking about Edouard Glissant and, the right to opacity and the idea that the state or the outside world does not have the right to know everything about me, that I get at some level to help kind of navigate and shape that conversation. So discourse on both a banal, ordinary level and then also a certain kind of structural, post-structural framework.
I hear two threads in this conversation, which I think are probably related, but I'm not seeing exactly how they're related. I'll put them this way, and you all can quibble with it, but I'm hearing a thread that is about me being identified. That could be by government structures, by legal structures, by social structures. And then the other thread is me either making an identity or owning an identity that is at least identifying myself, if not creating my identity. Devonya, I heard you wanting to hold on to that second one at least a little bit, even while you want to trouble it and say it's not isolated and, I can't do this in a vacuum and so on. But am I correct in identifying these two threads? And if so, how are they related?
I think you are correct that one is identified. I'd go so far as saying classified. I always think in practical terms about the census. And the story I tell my students is hiding from the census taker, which is a long Black American tradition. I won't go into details why that is, but even in this modern times, in the city where I live, they'd leave notes. The census taker came around, and I'm like, One day, I happened to be home, and I answered the door, and the census taker didn't ask me how I identified racially. The census taker just marked me as African American or Black. And then she's like, "Are you Black, not Hispanic?" And I got issues with that framework. There's this conflation of ethnicity and race, which obscures the diversity of Blackness in America, right? So if you're recently from Africa, you're African American, but not African American in the same way that someone who has been here since enslavement was legal is African American. And yet we're all functioning under this same banner with all these contradictions and different histories. And those forms of classification serve the purposes of the state in this case.
Yeah.
And some would argue we need to count and be counted because it goes to political representation. They mark me as something other than how I might describe myself, how I might understand myself within the context of my lineages, ancestries, histories, and communities. I think for certain groups, the identification cannot fully be separated from the making and or identifying of oneself.
What does it mean to choose identity?
I'm using it loosely to talk about, for example, my decision to call myself Black rather than African American. That is a selection. Not that I can choose from infinite possibilities. Or as I say to my students, can I choose to be white? I'm not saying that I desire to do that, but...
Well, and I was thinking about folks who are trans and the need to choose, the external pressure to identify as trans male, trans female, trans. There's so few categories. And so in some sense, that idea of deciding comes from a kind of finite set of terms that we can use publicly, socially, politically. And I guess these days it'll be even more finite.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So this is also one of the reasons why I think I stay away from the language of choice, thinking about Foucault and subjectivity and subjectivation, that in a way there is a little bit of governing, but there's also this imposition on who we are from an almost external perspective. Muslim women, for example, are identified as such because we don't have a set of familiar categories that would allow for multiplicity. This was something in the book that I had to come out and really think about at the end, which was to say, so how do I think about Black Muslim women versus Muslim women of color versus Black Muslim women from the African diaspora versus lighter-skinned Muslim women of color? And so Muslim becomes the category that unites this population, not for reasons of accuracy, but for recognition, a kind of salient signifier. It's so limiting that it doesn't really enable for a full possibility. And then on the other side of it, to be identified as Muslim within a court of law when you are trying to legislate a grievance, you are also faced with what Christy Dotson calls epistemic violence, with what she calls incompetence, that the obligation of your audience to try to understand what you are saying, to put it in a context that's educated, that often results in failure. A failure to meet one's obligation on the part of the judge. How do we address that failure? Because at some level, and this is the Kafkaesque problem, when you present yourself before the law, how do you become legible? One is legible only through the categories that are already afforded to you for possible acknowledgement. You're not legible unless the categories are there for you already. Otherwise, you have no access whatsoever. So when you're talking about identity, I'm like, yeah, I guess, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm thinking about institutional and politically shaped, influenced categories, whether we're thinking about this in terms of race, whether we're thinking about this in terms of so-called ethnicity, whether we're thinking about this in terms of gender and sexuality. And so it's always a particular kind of dialectical relationship. So it's not just dialogic, but it's dialectical. So it's about presenting and about a certain kind of negotiation, and then ultimately a certain, if you will, resolution that may emerge from a prior moment of contradiction.
And certain strategic choices, right? I may choose to identify myself, in my case, as a Black woman philosopher because it represents something in a meaning structure, but it is sort of inadequate. Thinking back to what you were saying about legibility, I think that speaks to your point about discourses.
Yeah.
Part of why we talk about discourses is that within those contexts, certain things are legible and other things are not. And so the possibility of being recognizable or legible and having some choice in that is, as Falguni noted, delimited by the possibilities within a particular discursive structure.
And I think, Devonya, this goes back to a point you made earlier, namely that if we think about identity using a model or placing it within a notion of discourse, you were quick to point out, look, discourse is not just about talking.
Right.
Discourse is also about listening. And I think what I hear you, Falguni, pointing out is, yeah, but that listening is constructed, at least in part, if not in certain cases in its entirety, with rules that determine who can speak, what you can say when you speak. And if you break those rules, then you are simply not heard. I now hear your use of the term incompetence that you borrowed from Dotson earlier in a slightly different way, namely that the discourse gives you the ability, that is the competence, to say things, and it removes that ability. You can be made incompetent by discourse. And so if we think about identity in this way, we can see the ways in which, even when I identify myself strategically, as Devonya said, that's not without its own risks. So Devonya, when you say I identify as a Black woman philosopher, I'm wondering, okay, what kind of competences then are heard by that? And are you now made competent in certain ways and incompetent in other ways?
Absolutely.
And that incompetence, which is imposed, becomes the grounds for dismissing your complaint.
Exactly.
Right. And I think this is a different kind of dismissal, denying the veracity of one's identity claim. I am not a philosopher. I don't necessarily do philosophy because I do it in this way or that way.
Well, I mean, you're looking at a representation of that, right? Like, I'm in gender studies.
As am I.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? I'm in gender studies. And so it's, you're not a philosopher. Welcome.
Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun.
Devonya, in your introduction to this topic, you talked both about this kind of metaphysics of identity, I am A and I'm not B, and we've been talking a lot about the social ways in which that happen. You also talked a bit about identity politics. This is a term that has come back. I mean, it went out of style for a while, and now it's come back for better or for worse. And so I'm wondering, the kind of identity we've been talking about, is that or is that not related to identity politics? And what the hell is identity politics?
Well, I think identity politics has come back in certain ways, much like equal application of the law has come back. It appeared in one form, and now we see it transformed, so to speak. So one of the first uses of the term identity politics is in the Combahee River Collective statement. This group formed in the 1970s, Black women, activists, thinkers, came together and they made a statement. And one of the things they say in the statement is identity politics has radicalized them. They use the term as a way to describe their lived experience of interlocking oppressions on the basis of race, gender, class, sexual orientation as a grounding point for how they understood the necessity of being engaged in the world. And what I think has been lost when we invoke the term identity politics is that it is not about excluding people who don't fit into your group, so to speak, but it was an acknowledgement of our positionality when we work to come together, to build solidarity, to think about ways in which we want to contribute to what I would describe as a common good. And importantly, the ways in which one's lived experience motivates a radical engagement with the world.
I think I understand the notion of identity politics coming from out of this collective. Is this just a different notion of identity than the one we've been talking about, or is there a relation? This seems much more, this seems much more an identity in the sense of I'm making my own identity, but I could also see how it points to the ways in which we are identified, or one is identified, in ways that are not of my own creation.
There are a few things. One of the things the term identity politics for the Combahee River Collective draws attention to is how one is positioned within systems, structures, and institutions. And those are not always of my choosing. That is very different than the way in which identity politics in the contemporary moment is invoked to talk about people who want some kind of specialist exception or unearned benefit that is viewed as divisive. And it's only divisive when certain people are asking for it.
Right. And it makes me feel bad about my race and all these things that these new laws in states are now saying it's no longer legal to make someone feel bad about their race or privilege.
Which really would have been interesting in Mississippi in the 60s, right?
But it's also, in a way, so this is perfectly controversial and it doesn't really matter, but in a way, isn't the history of philosophy a history of identity?
Yeah.
But there were no modifiers. And so suddenly when people came along and said, well, actually, that's not how this works for me. Now suddenly it's identity politics. But the history of philosophy, notions of friendship, notions of slavery in Aristotle, the oikos who gets to be free. This is the history of identity. This is the history of identity politics. And so suddenly it kind of parallels something very similar to the history of education in this country. The moment it becomes broadened, democratized, when people who look like Devonya and me enter, now suddenly education isn't really providing good education. Now suddenly we have whatever, SATs, GREs, et cetera, which were supposed to be the great neutralizer, but can be used to exclude as well. You know, identity's always been there. The problem is that there other folks are confronting and challenging the lack of modifiers in the history of philosophy. You now suddenly have things like feminist philosophy. You have philosophy of race. People who say, but actually the idea that the law sees me and will give me justice doesn't really work. Love you, Rick, but if I don't look like Rick, right? I mean, it works if I look like Rick. It doesn't work if I look like Devonya.
Yeah.
Right.
Apparently, that's the issue. It's like, well, why are we hiring people based on something other than merit? It's like, well, actually, we haven't established that merit happens to have an objective notion.
And why are we assuming that there's some kind of skill set in navigating the world from a position that is often viewed externally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, my argument for a very long time has been we don't need brilliant people. We need competent people who want to do the work.
I think your point, Falguni, that identity has always been involved in philosophy in particular, but we could take in other discourses, fields, political institutions, and so on, or non-political institutions for that matter. It plays on this notion that, as you said, there was no modifier, that something was not marked, and so therefore went without saying. The moment in which someone wants to mark that, as you say, by saying, wait a second, that doesn't match my experience of that thing you're talking about, then that's the moment where I say, well, you're playing identity politics and that's unfair because I was not playing identity politics. I was just, use any of the tropes, rational.
I followed the rules.
I'm following the rules, and my identity is automatically universalized and therefore is not an identity. And this is something Charles Mills has pointed out, right? All other identities never have the possibility of that kind of universalization.
And what's fascinating is that I think all of us went to the New School at some point.
No, not me.
But I mean, at least two of us in this conversation went to the New School. And we didn't, but philosophers talked about race from the moment that they got there.
Right.
Adorno, Benjamin, Arendt, the Frankfurt School at large. They talked about race, but that was not race. That was philosophy. And then suddenly we wanted to talk about race. It was like, oh, but philosophers don't do race. But we've always done race. And I believe Rick and I had those conversations even back then. It's like, race has always been an issue. So how interesting that suddenly when it is articulated and associated with certain kinds of visible presences, that then there's a conversation about how we're not really sticking to merit and the rule.
Right. So are we being unruly when we talk about race? And I want to push this. What exactly do we mean when we say race? And I'm asking this because I think people understand race much more narrowly than the ways I hear Falguni talking about it. So I want to kind of tease out how we're thinking race here, because I think some of the things Falguni is saying are alluding to a kind of unruliness or presumed unruliness when certain topics or contestations come to the fore.
Thanks for that opportunity to maybe develop that a little bit. I will say the unruly is used in everyday discourse as being intentionally ornery, defiant, but that's not how I'm using it. When I talk about unruly identity, I'm talking about that thing which is threatening to the polity or certain kinds of institutional power. So the unruly, again, is something which is imposed because it is a particular signifier that signals that something is out of order rather than being intentionally unruly, which we all are here anyway. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about unruly identity is like, what is it? Sovereign power, or depending upon what your framework is, that makes us think that this is something that has to be domesticated. So how do we decide that terrorists have to be preemptively sought? This happened well before 9/11. I mean, the history of loitering.
Yes.
After emancipation, all of that designed to domesticate the scary threat of having formerly enslaved people, Black people, God forbid, walk around on their own terms. Needed passports, et cetera. So this is a continuation of something that has happened for a very long time. And all of that to say that that's why I also think about race as not biological. And when I was first working on this, there's a huge set of incredible scholars who worked on this stuff well before me. Lucius Outlaw, Lewis Gordon, obviously Charles Mills, et cetera. Many, many, many folks who worked on race in the American context and often would think of it in terms of Blackness, even if it wasn't biological. It was just kind of really trying to think through what they saw that was unruly, if you will. In my case, I think of race as an umbrella category, like Blackness is a category of race. It doesn't fit neatly to say, oh, well, Blackness is like Latinx or is like South Asian identity or Asian American. Like it's not that. And yet, in all of these different cases, groups have been what I will call racialized, which is to say, have been subject to having something about them which is scary and threatening, domesticated through institutional procedures and targeted, so that they have been racialized at some point in time. Even if we think about Asian American as kind of geographical or geopolitical identity, it's a racialized category when we think in terms of the US or North America. Even Mexicans, this is a particular national identity, it's a historical identity, and yet it has been racialized, almost identified as a race. But this is a racialized category that is designed to ensure that their presence, that their movements in this thing that we now call the U.S., formerly Turtle Island, right, is boxed in, managed in a particular way. Racialization, then, is a particular process of dehumanizing and finding institutional approaches to that project, if you will.
So when you say institutional approaches to dehumanizing, does this also speak to the ways in which resources, material goods, political goods are allocated or not allocated? In other words, how do we tease out the processes of racialization? And I think in your work, you've talked about race and racializing as a technology.
And I call it a technology, right? So I'm drawing both on Heidegger's notion of technology and also on Foucault's notion of techne, that this is a particular apparatus dispositif to modify, to transmodify. Right. You know, in terms of resources, I mean, this is an interesting moment because I've been spouting this number and people are really shocked when I say this, but this is a particular moment where even though we associate this new administration's decision to deport undocumented or illegal migrants, and I'm using their language, we think of Mexicans as being the target. And in fact, the top 3 populations of undocumented folks in the United States are Mexicans. I think it's like 4 million or something. Salvadorans, 750,000 a couple of years ago entered. Third largest population, anybody want to guess? My people. Yeah. South Asian, but not all South Asian. Gujaratis.
Right.
People from my part of India are the third largest undocumented migrant population in the U.S.
Yeah.
Wow.
They're crossing from Canada and freezing to death or trying to cross and being intercepted by CBP. If you're on Instagram, which I don't recommend for your mental health, but I'm on there because I'm trying to catch a pulse, there are videos of these folks being stopped. This comes back to the resources aspect, Devonya. Right now, I don't think that the privation of resources is being directed to them, but what I'm seeing is the beginning of a process that is most certainly going to start scapegoating.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing it on Instagram. And this is from folks who are white, who are Black, who are Latino, putting up videos of Indians, South Asians from India, my people. I say that ironically because I was here well before most of these folks, who are literally ripping into them, which is a treatment that African Americans are very familiar with, and Latinx folks are very familiar with. But it was like, oh, okay, this is the beginning of that process. Got it. And I think we will start to see the deprivation of resources from them in the same breath that we are now seeing this bizarre debate about H-1B workers who, by the way, have a very strong MAGA component. And 75% of H-1B visas were given to Indians, have been for the last 15 years. Indians are also trying to avoid affirmative action politics in India because they think that they can just do straight tests and they're shocked that their kids are not getting in. And so they are also part of MAGA and also part of the anti-affirmative action crowd. So this is very interesting because the racializing technology is actually two-pronged. This is about people who selectively argue that they're victims when it's convenient and then selectively ascend to whiteness when it's convenient, or what Spivak calls strategic essentialism. And so we're watching this in this moment as there's a struggle for apparently scarce resources, because that's always the myth, between folks in this group who think that they're competing with each other and then with other populations of color. Sorry, that was long-winded, but...
No. And what I found really difficult to grapple with in what you just raised is that if unruly, to take it a little bit literally, means to not be within an order, that then an order has to be constructed in which you can be placed and therefore be disciplined or, as you put it, domesticated. At first, when you were raising that issue, I was thinking about political and legal policing institutions and so on that do this. But now you're talking about Instagram shows that this then gets intermingled with a whole set of social movements and social categories and ways in which people are thinking about things that we wouldn't so neatly put into a juridical institution or a political institution. And this, for me, is what makes such a categorization difficult to confront. There's no place you could attach onto as a place to start addressing attack or critique or revolt even. The dispersal of power is what makes it so nefarious.
To have a united front among other groups who are no longer or momentarily not being scapegoated, to unite and say, yeah, this is right, this is the next group. This is actually also part of that technology. That is part of the apparatus that will enable this group to be produced as a threat through law. It's like, send them back. And it was weird. I haven't looked at TikTok in 8 months. I turned it on reluctantly yesterday. I'm on this algorithm, and the algorithm is looking at people making fun of Indian people. I'm like, how am I on this? What the hell?
Right.
Indian school teachers in the U.S. or South Asian origin with very thick accents, making fun of their accents, and just showing a caricature. It's like, look at this. My son told me he wasn't doing well in math. That's it. That's the caption. And then they show this teacher. And it's over and over and over again. And the comments were like piling on. I'm like, oh, okay. Because it's unheard of yet. But we've seen this. It's cyclical. We saw this after emancipation when we had Chinese migrants who were undercutting wages both for emancipated Black folks and then also for white laborers. And so they were lynched and driven right down the West Coast into Mexico and then finally deported, right? The Exclusion Act, because they were threatening these wages. And what I'm hearing from my friends who work in the Taxi Workers Alliance, et cetera, is that taxi workers are voting for Trump. It's like, yeah, they're undercutting our wages. We don't need these illegal Indians here. So that's part of the process. But we've seen it. They don't know. They may not be aware of what this looks like, but we've seen this before. And that's part of the project of racializing and dehumanizing and deporting. And this administration will get the support that he needs all across different populations. And that's part of the technology.
And what I hear you suggesting is it's not precisely an exclusion of groups. It is a use of groups to engineer the coherence of a particular sort of polis. What I'm trying to get around to asking is, how then might we think about identity in its relationship to the polis or its relationship to citizenship or subject positions, participants in a governmental or state apparatus?
I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think the thing that we need to come back to is capital. I mean, because in some sense, immigration policy is not about people, it's about capital. In most senses, right? The whole point of undocumented workers is that they are useful to be exploited. But if you're letting people in, procedurally, what you're looking at is how they are adding to your economy. That's why H-1B is so popular, because you can bring in a population of folks who are skilled, who are often upper class, and you also don't have to pay them the regular benefits. They're also here as guest workers. If their visa gets revoked, they don't have a lot of time and they run the risk of being deported, but you don't have to pay them full benefits. It's about capital. It's about the economy. As philosophers, we don't talk about this nearly enough. There are a few folks who do really nice work on this, like Guillaumard and others, obviously the Marxists and the radical folks. But I think we have to think about how demographics intersect with capital. Nancy Fraser obviously does a lot of stuff on redistribution and recognition, but even most recently, she's still somewhat reluctant to think about race in those intersections. But when we start looking at money, if we can look at how much people do or don't cost and how much profit they stand to make for, I'll just say tech bros and venture capitalists, then we know who will be allowed into the country legally. Because it is all predicated on the perception of scarce resources, which we know is a blatant lie.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, there's not enough. It's like, there's plenty. I mean, we're talking about housing shortages. Are you kidding me? We don't have a housing shortage. We have a shortage of affordable housing because hedge funds have bought up all existing stock and are renting at exorbitant prices or holding. But we don't have a housing shortage problem. We have plenty of empty apartments in Atlanta. Yeah. It's about the perception of scarce resources, because that also then allows you to apply for money from the state to build even more.
Right.
Another rant, but...
Hey there, barflies. We don't often say stop listening, but I'm asking you to press pause right now on this episode and help us out. If you haven't already done so, go to hotelbarsessions.patreon.com to support this podcast. It's easy, it's cheap, we have several levels of sponsorship available, and for less than the cost of a round of drinks per month, you could help us cover our production costs and keep serving up these straight shots of wisdom every week. Not ready to commit to a Patreon sponsorship just yet? No worries. You can still support the podcast by visiting our website at hotelbarpodcast.com. Click on the Support Us page, where you can make one-time donations via PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. While you've got us on pause, double-check that you're following Hotel Bar Sessions on social media. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Share our posts with your friends and let us know what you think about each new episode. We honestly never expected this podcast to grow as much or as fast as it did. But thank you all for listening. Please consider throwing a few bucks in our tip jar.
As Falguni was talking about the relationship between race and its productions of identity, I kept thinking about W.B. Du Bois, who says, race is the most ingenious invention of the modern age. And one of the ways he thought about race was that it had an economic function.
Yeah.
Things that Falguni has described as racialization and those connections to certain capital interests Du Bois also talked about as essentially the function of race, to produce classes of people that one can identify and mark for a certain form of capital exploitation.
Yeah, so much of this harkens back to Du Bois. I hesitate to invoke him because I think I'll invoke him incorrectly, but I think that's right. He almost had a full PhD in economics, right?
Yes, among many things, and had extensive training in philosophy. And I find it curious that more people do not identify him as a philosopher, despite all the work he did with American philosophers. And I'm also thinking in that respect, trying to wind us back, how we might link our discussions of identity to questions about what we might in political philosophy talk about as a polis, a political group of actors and interests. The meat of identity, beyond just saying something about how we work to talk about who we are, a lot of it is also about the kinds of commitments that we take up in the world. Mm-hmm. Commitments that we feel obliged to assume and those that are pressed upon us.
I mean, one bridge between Falguni's talking about the flow of capital and the economic meaning of migration and immigration, including the categories of who has a visa, who is a citizen, and so on, is I heard, and I never had to take the citizenship exam because I was born in the U.S., but I heard that there's a question on the citizenship exam: what is the economic system of the United States? And the answer, of course, is capitalism. Mm-hmm. What I find interesting about that is that has nothing to do with the political constitution of the United States or any country for that matter. And so there, what I find fascinating is the explicit recognition of the relationship between citizenship and capitalism. Mm-hmm. That is, you will be a citizen as long as you acknowledge that we are capitalists here. And so there is an official juridical sense of enforcing a certain economic interest as a gate to political participation in the state form of politics. I mean, electing representatives, presidents, senators, and so on.
I think it's a more recent question because I think it's a response to the Cold War, kind of communists in our midst. So I think that's actually part of it. I mean, the irony is when I was applying for citizenship, which is a whole story, there are two interesting questions, and I would throw out the application every single year, starting college until I was 30. Do you smoke pot, right? Or do you do any kind of drugs? It's like, well, I went to Berkeley and like, hello, here you go, the whole town, whole city, right?
You could say you didn't inhale.
Right. But this was before Clinton. Actually, yeah, I could have. I should have. And then the second question was, have you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And the third question was, were you a member of the Nazi Party between 1933 and 1945?
Well, because the Nazis in the 50s are fine.
Exactly. And today.
And thereafter.
So those three questions. Were you ever a communist? Sorry, disqualifies you. But if you were only a Nazi for 12 years, you're good. Yeah, never mind pot, right? Or other kinds of drugs. So the free market question, I think, is a response to that in part.
And I think this kind of goes, again, to bridging this discussion of capital to Devonya's questions about political participation and being active in the polis. Even the Cold War scenario was not couched as a war between freedom and totalitarianism, a war between democracy and authoritarianism. It was couched as a war between capitalism and communism, as if capitalism stands for freedom or democracy and communism stands for authoritarianism and totalitarianism. But there, again, the notion of what counts as the body politic is shot through with ensuring the maintenance of capitalism and the flow of capital. You know, when we talk about migration from a juridical point of view, like who gets to claim asylum, for example, where do we send people when they do claim asylum? Do they come into the country? Do we have them wait where they are? All of this, as you were pointing out, I think earlier, Falguni, has a whole lot to do with the flow of capital, both into the country and within the country itself.
And remember, we also tie loans to whether or not the countries of origin, Mexico, et cetera, all up and down Latin America, have free markets and whether or not they will eradicate their social safety nets.
Right.
So NAFTA, 1992, was the free exchange of what? Labor? It was actually about capital. It was about moving capital to Mexico and eliminating labor protections. So that's the other thing is like, so we're creating the conditions that leave people completely evacuated of the ability to take care of themselves and to make money. This is a U.S. imposed practice that is leading people to come to the U.S. So, Rick, you're totally on target. This is about directing the flow of capital, literally starving them, and then creating the space. Not even creating, forcing a space where people are migrating to the U.S. And so the absence of a discussion of history enables that kind of narrative. Memory, forgetting, selective stories.
And the people who arrive produced through this process, we then label as illegals.
And parasites.
We give them the identity of the unruly, would you say, or is that a mischaracterization?
No, I get what you're saying. And part of what I'm thinking about is, do we turn to Sartre here? Do we turn to bad faith? I wonder if part of the unruliness that we associate with these groups is a mark of bad faith. We did this stuff.
You can say shit. We're a cuss-friendly podcast.
Okay, excellent. That's how I think of this, is that in part, unruliness is about bad faith, too.
It is also about perception, right? It is not this population is actually unruly. They are characterized as unruly, generated as a perceived threat.
I think that's right. And I'm wondering why we don't perceive hedge fund owners as threats.
And they are actual threats, unlike the migrants who are not threats.
As 2008 tells us, right?
Yeah.
And to bring this back to a point you made earlier, Falguni, I'm, again, as I did in my rant, reflecting on the experience of Central and South American communities in Chicago now that ICE is on the streets. As listeners of the podcast know, I have connections to the Polish community here in Chicago. I mean, come on, there are thousands of undocumented people living in the Polish community from Poland. And as far as I can tell, they show no worry about any of this because ICE is not in the Polish neighborhood. ICE is in Little Village and Pilsen. That is the communities from Central and South America.
Well, and I want to connect this back to Dotson on incompetence, both the epistemology of ignorance by Mills, but epistemic incompetence and violence. I mean, I think we got to come to terms with the fact that violence is also an epistemology. Like, it's a way of seeing. It's a way of knowing. And it has been embedded in the foundations from a very long time. Like, I have a paper on Locke where I just trace this out. The epistemology of violence is right there. And part of that has to do with his logic of self-defense and the grounds that, well, the only reason why an Englishman would hurt someone is if he was defending himself. And so he has the right to kill, but instead he'll be very magnanimous and just enslave. But it's a weird logic. I went back because I'm in the South and looked at the archives of the Carolinas. In those original documents, Locke actually says colonists will not attack Indians. That is banned. And lo and behold, colonists, right, of the Carolinas attacked Indians. Like, they killed them and they cleared the land, and they discovered this was an easy way to do that. And they discovered that people at home were not happy about this in England. And so the narrative was like, oh, but we did it in self-defense. And so they project aggression that they themselves have loaded and then use that to argue that this is why they had to clear the land and kill indigenous folks or sell them. Like, this is in Locke. All this historiography has so much evidence. There's all this language about Barbadosing indigenous folks like Coosa Indians and others, which meant just offshoring them, selling them to Barbados to clear the land so that they could settle it. This is a long-standing history, and that's how it happens. I'm arguing that we should think of this as an epistemology of violence. And then in some sense, when you look at the history of the American annexation of Mexico, right, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexican rancheros and those who were settled in the southwest of what is now the U.S. were given the option of either declaring their allegiance to the U.S. or to Mexico. And they were promised that if they declared their allegiance to the U.S., but it had to be within 3 years, they would get to keep their land. Maria Montoya has a book on how the Supreme Court pretty much took all of that land and justified it through Supreme Court decisions. And now we are talking about Mexicans invading. That is the logic that we're seeing. And it's laid out in 1688 and then also the Constitution of the Carolinas. Like, you can trace it out. This is the basis of the social contract.
Right. Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
To push again on the point of identity, certain people can invoke the notion of self-defense to justify their violence, while others are not allowed the protection of self-defense as legitimating the use of violence. And I'm thinking here in a more contemporary moment about stand your ground laws,
right?
For example. A person of color invoking a stand your ground law is less likely to elude legal punishments for their use of violence. Whereas if they are acted upon in a violent way under the invocation of stand your ground laws, it is often taken to be justified and legal. I'm struck by your conversation about violence as an epistemology. It leans into the fabric of race as a technology, and how this also begins to further elaborate some of the things we might need to say about identity as political theorists and as philosophers.
Again, I keep coming back to the use of identity, but I think I have been thinking in terms of recognition. That's where I enter the literature, is through not so much Hegel, although looking at criticisms of Hegel, through Fanon and through Coulthard, an indigenous scholar who is a political philosopher, Glenn Coulthard. His observation that Fanon points out that Hegel's notion of recognition doesn't work in the colonies. It is not intersubjective. It is not mutual. I think he says it on page 3 of Damné de la Terre. Because in the colonies, one is only recognized for their ability to be exploited or for their ability to labor. Using that, Coulthard makes an argument that recognition is asymmetrical, fundamentally asymmetrical.
Yeah.
This is a kind of colonial understanding of recognition, so it can never interpolate subjects in some kind of fair, just way. And so I use that to think about how subjects are misrecognized or dismissed. And so then the question for me is, well, if that's the case, given that I am also thinking about Glissant and the right to opacity, is it possible to kind of think about misrecognition as a form of resistance? There's this terrific book, I'm blanking on the title, but the author is Ethne Lupide, who is at Arizona State, where she points to different kinds of migrant populations and the way that they are interrogated for their claims to asylum or refugee status or immigration status, and asked about whether they're queer. And then there's a whole discussion on the part of the immigration agents who were doing this, who are like, well, you don't look queer. Or are you really queer? What does that look like? But you're wearing a dress or whatever. And so there is a certain kind of needing to reproduce these subjects according to the incompetence, to borrow Dotson again, that they come into the interview with. Why not then just form this as a form of resistance? That's fine. I mean, I know a lot of people are going to be like, oh my God, but Law and Order. was like, we already don't have law and order. So I'm not sure why misrecognition is some big departure from law and order as a form of decolonial resistance. Like, what obligation do people have? Now, the risks are high, but I think we need to think about this because recognition at some level is never accurate. Most levels are not accurate.
As a less abstract metaphor for that, one of the people who works on AI justice discovered that if she put on a white mask, she was more readily identifiable by facial recognition technology. And I was thinking, well, isn't there a way to elude a certain kind of surveillance if it literally can't see you? I mean, aside from getting run over by driverless vehicles,
Right.
Which is kind of a bummer.
I think driverless vehicles in general are a bummer, but okay.
Yes, but this is what I've heard. Don't come at me, listeners, if I am incorrect, but I've heard that technology also has problems recognizing people of color, right?
Oh, yeah. That's one of its hallmarks, right?
But I like ending with opacity and strategic misrecognition because I think it is a nice counterpoint to the fact that one does not choose. It can make registerable a way in which people contest some of these impositions.
Well, the bartender has not engaged in strategic misrecognition, but she has recognized us for being unruly and staying well past last call. Before we go, Falguni, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. It was both really deeply philosophical and also concrete and to the moment. Unfortunately, I think we have to say. But yeah, I just want to thank you.
Thank you both and to Lee for inviting me and allowing me to have a fantastic philosophical conversation.
Woo-hoo.
I appreciate it.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.